The graduation invitation came wrapped in tissue paper inside a cream envelope that smelled faintly of expensive perfume, and Graham Whitaker stood holding it in the doorway of his small house in Tacoma for a long moment before he could make himself open it. Behind him, the kitchen radio murmured low jazz, and the smell of burnt toast still hung in the air from breakfast. His daughter, Nora, 9 years old, sat at the table swinging her legs and reading the back of a cereal box like it contained state secrets. "What is it, Dad?" she asked, not looking up. Graham turned the envelope over. The handwriting was unmistakable, looping and confident, the same handwriting that used to leave notes on his pillow a lifetime ago, Vivian Lockhart. He hadn't said that name out loud in 8 years. He opened it slowly. Inside was a graduation announcement, gold foil lettering on heavy cardstock. "Please join us in celebrating the graduation of Marguerite Lockhart Pierce from Stanford University, summa cum laude." Beneath the formal print, in Vivian's own hand, a short note, "Graham, it's been so long. I'd love for you to come and see how far we've all come. Bring whoever you'd like, Marguerite." His daughter's half-sister, a child he barely knew, born 2 years after Vivian had walked out the door of their cramped apartment in Spokane carrying one suitcase and a folder of law school transcripts. He had not been invited to a single birthday, recital, or holiday in all the years since, and now, out of nowhere, an invitation arrived dressed up as kindness. Graham knew Vivian too well to mistake this for kindness. He set the card down on the counter and looked at it the way a man looks at a bill he suspects is wrong. Nora noticed the shift in his face, the way kids always do, faster than adults give them credit for. "Daddy, you look weird," she said. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he said and made himself smile. "Eat your cereal." 3,000 miles away, in a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the bay in Palo Alto, Vivian Lockhart Pierce sat at her vanity while her sister fastened the clasp of a sapphire necklace behind her neck. "You really think he'll show up?" her sister asked, amused. "He'll show up," Vivian said, studying her reflection. "Graham's the kind of man who shows up even when it humiliates him. That's the thing about good men. You can always count on their pride being smaller than their decency." Her sister laughed. "Didn't he end up doing handyman work or something? I heard he never finished that contractor's license." "Last I checked, he was still fixing other people's roofs," Vivian said, and there was something underneath her amusement that didn't sound like amusement at all. It sounded old. It sounded like a wound that had healed crooked. 9 years earlier, Graham Whitaker had been the only man Vivian believed she would ever need. They had been 23 and 24, broke and ambitious in the way only very young people can be, sharing a studio apartment above a laundromat in Spokane while Vivian studied for the LSAT and Graham worked 2 jobs, framing houses by day, stocking a warehouse 3 nights a week, just to keep the lights on. Graham used to leave coffee and a granola bar by her study lamp before he left for his morning shift, because he knew she'd forget to eat otherwise. He sold the only thing of value he owned, his late father's hunting rifle, a Winchester that had been passed down 2 generations, to cover the deposit on her bar exam prep course. He never told her where the money came from. He let her believe it was overtime pay, but ambition, once it gets its hooks into a person, doesn't share well with anything. Vivian wanted out of the laundromat apartment, out of the second-hand furniture, out of nights spent splitting a single value meal burger because rent was due. And when she met Desmond Pierce, a venture capital associate with a corner office and a watch that cost more than Graham's truck, she began to see Graham differently. Less like a partner, more like an anchor tied to her ankle while everyone else was swimming toward shore. The night she left, it was raining, the kind of steady Pacific Northwest rain that never seems dramatic enough for the moment it's drowning. She stood by the door with one suitcase. "I can't keep loving you and drowning at the same time, Graham," she'd said, not cruelly, which somehow made it worse. He hadn't argued. He hadn't begged. He had simply nodded once and stepped aside, the way a man does when he has decided that loving someone sometimes means refusing to make their leaving harder than it has to be. What Vivian never knew, what she had never bothered to ask, was that 9 months after she left, Graham found out she was pregnant. Not by him. By Desmond, conceived in the overlap of an affair that had started before she ever packed that suitcase. He found out by accident from a mutual friend at a wedding, and he never said a word to anyone. He simply absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, quietly, and kept working. He had his own daughter, by then anyway. Nora had come from a brief relationship 2 years after Vivian left, with a woman named Renee who decided, 6 months into motherhood, that she wasn't built for it and signed away her rights without much ceremony. Graham had been raising Nora alone ever since, in a rented house with a crooked porch step he kept meaning to fix, on a contractor's income that fluctuated more than he liked. He read Vivian's note 3 more times that night after Nora went to bed. "Bring whoever you'd like." He thought about not going at all. He thought about it for a long time. But there was a stubborn, quiet part of him, the same part that had once carried 2 jobs without complaint, that refused to let Vivian believe she had broken something in him permanently. So 2 weeks later, he called in a favor with an old army buddy who still did private contracting work, packed 2 bags, and told Nora they were going on a trip to California. "Is it a vacation?" Nora had asked, delighted. "Something like that," Graham said. The Lockhart-Pierce family had not built their wealth quietly. Desmond's venture firm had backed 3 companies that went public in the last 5 years, and the graduation reception was held at a vineyard estate outside Palo Alto, the kind of place with hand-laid stone paths and a guest list heavier with venture capitalists than relatives. String lights threaded between olive trees. A jazz trio played near a fountain. Caterers moved through the crowd with trays of food that had names longer than most people's job titles. Vivian moved through the party in a pale blue dress, accepting compliments about Marguerite's acceptance into a graduate program at Cambridge, smiling for photographs, and every few minutes glancing toward the entrance. "You're doing that thing again," her sister murmured. "Watching the door." "I'm not watching anything," Vivian said. She had arranged with what she told herself was simple practicality for Graham to be seated at a table near the service entrance. Beside elderly second cousins and a few distant relatives nobody bothered to introduce themselves to. She had imagined him sitting there in an ill-fitting jacket, awkward and overwhelmed, watching her family's success swirl around him like water around a stone. The image gave her a satisfaction she didn't examine too closely, because examining it would have meant admitting what it actually was. By early evening, the estate glowed gold under string lights and a setting sun, then a black SUV came up the long gravel drive, then another behind it, then a third. Conversations near the entrance thinned out. A valet frowned and signaled toward the gate. The first vehicle's doors opened, and 2 men in dark, unremarkable suits stepped out. Not flashy, not theatrical, just precise, scanning the property with the kind of practiced calm that didn't announce itself but couldn't be missed either. "Who is that?" someone murmured near the bar. Desmond, Vivian's husband, frowned across the lawn. "Did somebody invite a senator?" The rear door of the third SUV opened, and Graham Whitaker stepped out, holding his daughter's hand. The crowd's noise dimmed by degrees, the way a room quiets when something doesn't fit the pattern it expected. Graham wore a simple charcoal suit, no flash, nothing performative, and yet nothing about him resembled the exhausted paycheck-to-paycheck man Vivian remembered. He moved unhurried, grounded, with a kind of stillness that made people instinctively lower their voices. Nora walked beside him in a yellow sundress, her hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, looking around at the vineyard with wide, delighted eyes. Vivian's stomach dropped before her mind caught up to why. One of the men from the SUV leaned close to Graham and murmured something. Graham nodded once, and the man stepped back, falling into a quiet, deliberate position near the perimeter of the lawn. "Why is everyone staring at us, Daddy?" Nora asked, looking up. "Because people sometimes mistake quiet for weak," Graham said gently. Vivian heard the voice before she registered the words, older, steadier, but unmistakably his, and something in her chest tightened in a way she hadn't felt in years. She forced herself across the lawn. "Graham," she said with practiced warmth, "you came." He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Congratulations on Marguerite, Vivian. No edge in it, no old wound on display." Somehow that disappointed her more than anger would have. She had wanted some flicker of the man she left, wounded, proving something, desperate for her approval. Instead, he stood there like someone who had already survived something far heavier than heartbreak. "And this must be your daughter," Vivian said, looking down at Nora. "This is Nora," Graham said. "She's the best thing that ever happened to me." Something in Vivian's chest cracked slightly, because years ago, in a different apartment, he had said almost the same words about her. Desmond stepped forward, hand extended, his California casual confidence sliding into place like a mask snapping shut. "Desmond Pierce, Vivian's told me a lot about you." "I doubt that," Graham said evenly, shaking his hand. Desmond noted the calluses on Graham's palm, working hands, not soft, not manicured, but also noticed the watch at his wrist, understated but clearly not cheap. "Quite an entrance," Desmond said, with a laugh that came out thinner than he intended. "Long drive," Graham said simply. A catering manager hurried over, visibly flustered. "Mr. Whitaker, we didn't realize. We can move your seating to the terrace, of course, if—" "Table by the kitchen is fine," Graham said. The manager blinked, glanced at Vivian and Desmond, and lowered his voice. "Of course, sir." He walked away with the brisk, nervous energy of a man who had just realized he was standing too close to something important. Desmond watched the exchange with narrowing eyes. "You know him?" "We've crossed paths," Graham said, and offered nothing more. By the time dinner began, whispers moved through the reception like wind through wheat. Someone claimed Graham consulted for the Department of Defense. Someone else swore he ran a private equity fund out of Seattle that nobody could find public records for. A guest leaned toward Desmond near the bar. "You know who your wife invited?" Desmond smirked. "Some old boyfriend. That man runs Whitaker Resilient Holdings. They quietly bought the controlling stake in 2 failed mid-cap construction firms last year and turned them around in 11 months. Nobody in our circles ever met him in person before tonight." Desmond's smile faded by degrees. "Whitaker what?" "Exactly," the guest said. "Nobody talks about it. That's the whole point." Across the lawn, Graham sat with Nora near the back, exactly where Vivian had intended for him to feel small. Instead, eyes kept drifting toward him anyway, drawn by something nobody could quite articulate. "Daddy," Nora whispered, eating a strawberry off her plate. "Are we fancy now?" Graham smiled at her, soft and tired. "No more fancy than anyone else." "Then why do those men keep watching you?" He glanced briefly toward the 2 men stationed near the tree line. "Because sometimes keeping people safe means being ready before trouble shows up." Nora considered this with the gravity only a 9-year-old can summon, then nodded and went back to her strawberry. Vivian watched them from across the lawn the entire evening, telling herself she wasn't watching. It wasn't his wealth that unsettled her, or the quiet security detail, or the rumors swirling like smoke. It was his calm. Graham should have looked broken sitting at the edges of her daughter's graduation, watching the life she'd built without him. Instead, he looked like a man who had already weathered something far worse than humiliation and come out the other side lighter for it. For the first time since mailing the invitation, a cold thread of doubt wound through Vivian's certainty. Later, as the band shifted to something slower and guests drifted toward the dance floor, Nora wandered toward the dessert table and returned with 2 macarons triumphantly stacked on a napkin. "I negotiated," she announced to her father. "Did you?" Graham said, the corner of his mouth lifting. Vivian found herself walking toward them before she'd consciously decided to. "Your dress is so pretty," Nora said to her. Unprompted, sincere in the unfiltered way only children manage. "Thank you, sweetheart," Vivian said, caught off guard by the gentleness in her own voice. "Daddy said you used to hate fancy things," Nora said, swinging her macaron slightly. "He said you used to wear his old flannel shirts and steal his fries." Vivian felt her throat tighten. Memories she had buried under a decade of curated dinner parties surfaced all at once. Sitting cross-legged on a second-hand mattress eating gas station tacos because they couldn't afford the diner down the street, falling asleep in his old flannel while she highlighted case law, laughing so hard over burnt pancakes at 1 a.m. that the neighbors banged on the wall. They'd had nothing, and somehow, impossibly, they had been happier than she had been in any of the years since. "Sophie, why don't you go find the lemonade table?" Graham said gently, and caught himself immediately, his face flickering with something like embarrassed confusion. "Sorry, Nora. Go find the lemonade table." Nora, unbothered, skipped off toward the refreshments. Vivian's eyebrows lifted slightly at the slip, but she let it pass. "She's wonderful," she said instead. "She saved my life, honestly," Graham said. "I don't know what I would have done without her these past few years." Vivian studied him. "You seem different. People usually are after almost a decade. That's not what I mean." She crossed her arms. "You seem at peace. I expected." She stopped herself. "You expected me to walk in here bitter," Graham finished for her quietly. "Broken, maybe. So you could feel better about everything." Vivian flinched. "That's not fair, isn't it?" His voice wasn't sharp. If anything, it was almost gentle, which made it land harder. She opened her mouth to argue and found nothing there, because somewhere beneath the practiced composure, she knew exactly why she'd sent that invitation. Graham leaned against the stone wall bordering the vineyard, looking out over the rows of vines turning purple in the dusk. "You know, the strange part," he said. "I was never angry that you left. How is that possible?" Vivian's voice cracked slightly. "Because I knew what loving me actually cost you back then," he said. 2 jobs, a mattress on the floor, no future you could see the edges of. I knew. I just hoped it would be enough anyway." Vivian's mind reeled backward. Graham coming home covered in drywall dust, falling asleep upright at the kitchen table out of sheer exhaustion, slipping his last 20 into her coat pocket the week before an exam and claiming he'd found it in his jacket. She remembered crying once over an unpaid LSAT registration fee, and how the next morning an envelope with the exact amount appeared on the counter, no explanation given beyond "found some extra work." Years later, a cousin mentioned, almost in passing, that Graham had sold his father's rifle that same month. She had never put it together until just now. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she whispered. "Tell you what? How much it cost me?" Graham shook his head slowly. "Because love isn't supposed to feel like a debt you owe someone." The words landed somewhere deep and unguarded in her chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music drifted faintly behind them, and the whole glittering party suddenly felt very far away. Why did you really come tonight? She finally asked. Graham thought about it honestly before answering. Nora wanted to see California. And maybe, he added, quieter, some part of me wanted to know if you were happy. Vivian almost laughed at the simplicity of it, except her throat was too tight to manage it. Before she could respond, Desmond appeared at her side, two champagne flutes in hand, his eyes flicking warily toward Graham. Everything all right out here? Fine, Vivian said too quickly. Desmond handed her a glass and turned to Graham with a smile that didn't reach past his teeth. I still can't quite figure you out. Most people don't need to, Graham said. There it is, Desmond chuckled. That mysterious thing you've got going. Guys in my world usually can't wait to tell you how much they're worth. You seem almost embarrassed by it. Money impresses people who are insecure, Graham said. Safety impresses me. Desmond's smile thinned. Safety. Graham glanced toward Nora, now laughing with another child near the dessert table. Everything I built so nothing could touch her. That's it. That's the whole reason. Vivian followed his gaze, and something inside her chest quietly broke apart. Graham had never wanted power for its own sake. He'd built a fortress, not a throne. She had spent 9 years assuming he'd simply failed to keep up with her ambitions, when in truth he had quietly, devastatingly succeeded at the only ambition that ever mattered to him. You really expect us to believe all this security is necessary? Desmond asked, gesturing vaguely toward the men near the trees. Sometimes visibility creates danger, Graham said. What are you, some kind of spy now? Desmond's tone aimed for joking and missed. Graham almost smiled. No, then what exactly are you? For the first time that evening, something shifted behind Graham's eyes. Not anger, something heavier, memory. A man who learned the hard way what happens when you can't protect the people you love, he said quietly. Desmond looked confused. Vivian wasn't. A memory surfaced unbidden, the final months before Graham had pulled away from her entirely all those years ago, before she'd ever met Desmond. Strange late-night phone calls he wouldn't explain. A bruise along his jaw, he claimed, came from a job site accident. The way he'd started insisting she'd take a different route home from her internship. At the time, she'd assumed it was financial stress curdling into paranoia. Standing here now, she wasn't sure anymore. The reception rolled on, golden light fading into the soft blue of early evening, and Vivian found her attention dragged constantly toward the back of the lawn, where Graham sat with Nora, utterly unbothered by the small parade of guests now finding excuses to approach him. A tech founder asked careful questions about supply chain consulting. A retired judge mentioned, almost reverently, a name, Whitaker Resilient Holdings, that made two nearby executives visibly straighten. Near the bar, Desmond pulled an old investor friend aside. Tell me what you actually know about this guy. The investor hesitated. Not much, honestly. That's what makes it interesting. Nobody's met him before tonight. He doesn't do panels, doesn't do interviews. Word is he personally vetoed 3 acquisition offers last year because he didn't trust the buyer's labor practices. That's absurd, Desmond muttered. Turning down money on principle? That's the rumor, the investor said. People say he still does site visits himself. Shows up in work boots. Desmond stared across the lawn at Graham, who was at that exact moment letting Nora balance a strawberry on his nose to make her laugh, and felt, for the first time all evening, a thin thread of genuine unease. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the second wave of headlights came up the gravel drive. Not SUVs this time, but 2 plain sedans. A woman stepped out first, silver-haired, sharply dressed, flanked by 2 assistants. The moment she crossed into the light of the string lanterns, conversations near the entrance died entirely. That's Renata Okafor, someone whispered near the bar. Why is she here? Renata Okafor ran one of the largest institutional investment funds on the West Coast, a woman known for being nearly impossible to reach and even harder to impress. Desmond had spent the better part of 2 years trying to get a meeting with her office about funding for his next venture round, without success, and now she was walking, unannounced, directly across his daughter's graduation party. Desmond straightened his jacket and stepped forward with his most polished smile. Monsieur Okafor, what an honor, Desmond Pierce. She glanced at him, brief and unimpressed. I know who you are. Then she walked past him without another word, directly toward Graham. The lawn went quiet, watching. Graham rose to greet her, calm as ever. Nora's face lit up. Auntie Renata. Renata's stern expression softened instantly. There's my favorite negotiator. Did you talk your dad into dessert again? 2 macarons, Nora said proudly. Scandalous. Renata gave her shoulder an affectionate squeeze, then turned to Graham, her tone shifting back to business. We need a minute. The Caldwell board wants your decision tonight, not tomorrow. Several nearby guests, overhearing, exchanged uneasy looks. Graham opened the folder she handed him, scanning the contents without visible reaction. What board? Desmond asked, stepping closer, his voice tighter now. Renata looked at him directly for the first time. The board considering the emergency buyout of Pierce Ventures' construction portfolio. The lawn around them seemed to inhale at once. Desmond blinked. "Excuse me?" "Your limited partners approved the emergency review this afternoon," Renata said, unbothered. Desmond let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "That's impossible. We haven't even." "It's not impossible," Graham said quietly, closing the folder. "Just unfortunate timing. You're trying to buy my company," Desmond said, his face draining of color. "I'm deciding whether it's worth saving," Graham said. Whispers rippled outward through the crowd. Vivian stared at Graham as though she were meeting him for the first time. The same man who had once sold his father's rifle to cover her exam fees now held the power, with a single decision, to unmake everything Desmond had spent a decade building. "You planned this," Desmond said, stepping closer, his voice low and dangerous. "I came because your wife invited me," Graham said evenly. "Nothing more." Desmond turned sharply toward Vivian. "What is going on?" She couldn't answer because her mind had already split open around a much bigger realization. "Daddy," Nora whispered, tugging his sleeve, sensing the shift in the air. "People look scared." Graham crouched slightly beside her. "Sometimes the truth makes people uncomfortable, sweetheart. It's all right." Renata's expression sobered further. "There's more," she said, and handed Graham a second document. He read it in silence. A shadow passed briefly across his face, the first real change in his composure all evening. "What is it?" Vivian asked before she could stop herself. Graham looked toward Desmond. "Federal investigators executed warrants on 3 of your shell entities in Delaware 2 hours ago." Desmond went rigid. That's a mistake." "Several members of your finance team already accepted cooperation agreements," Renata said calmly. "You did this," Desmond snapped at Graham, his composure finally cracking open. "No," Graham said, his voice steady but harder now. "You did." Vivian's heart pounded as she looked between the two men, Desmond unraveling in real time, sweating through his collar, and Graham standing exactly as still as he had all evening, like a man who had long ago learned that storms eventually reveal what people are made of. And underneath it all, she noticed something in his face that surprised her more than anything else that night. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired, almost sad. Before anyone could speak again, the gate at the end of the gravel drive opened a final time. 4 agents in dark jackets walked up the path, badges visible, expressions unreadable. Cameras stopped, the band's music died mid-phrase. One agent walked directly to Desmond. "Desmond Pierce, we have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of securities fraud and money laundering." The lawn dissolved into chaos. Guests reached for their phones. Desmond spun toward Vivian, panic raw on his face. "Say something. Tell them this is insane." But Vivian couldn't move because at that exact moment another realization crashed through her, colder than the first. He knew, not just tonight, years ago. The strange calls, the bruise on his jaw, the insistence she change her commute. Graham hadn't been falling apart under financial stress all those years ago. He had been trying to protect her from something dangerous circling close enough to touch them both. She watched the agents lead Desmond away in handcuffs, his protest fading into the dusk, and turned slowly toward Graham. "You knew," she whispered. "All those years ago. You knew something." Graham was quiet for a long moment, then nodded once. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice broke on the question. "Because you were already being watched," he said softly. "The moment you started your internship at Callaway Legal, your name got tied to people I didn't trust. People connected to Desmond before you ever met him properly at that fundraiser." Vivian's breath caught. "So you left. I disappeared," Graham corrected gently. "Because staying close to you would have put you directly in danger. I couldn't explain it without exposing you to exactly the thing I was trying to keep away from you." Her knees nearly buckled. 9 years. 9 years of believing he had simply failed to keep up with her, while he had been quietly carrying a secret heavy enough to end both their lives, and had chosen every single day not to make it her burden. Around them, the party continued collapsing into chaos. Guests fleeing toward their cars, photographers capturing images that would dominate headlines by morning, but Vivian barely registered any of it. She could only see Graham, standing calm in the wreckage of an evening she had built specifically to humiliate him. He hadn't come to destroy her life. He had come carrying a truth he'd sacrificed 9 years of his own happiness to protect her from. The story dropped out of headlines within a week, the way these things always do, replaced by the next scandal, the next viral clip. But the humiliation didn't fade so easily for Vivian. Footage of federal agents walking Desmond off the vineyard in handcuffs circulated everywhere, dissected by financial news anchors for days. Investors distanced themselves publicly. Former colleagues denied ever fully trusting him. But the image people kept replaying wasn't Desmond's arrest. It was Vivian, frozen in her pale blue dress, watching her entire constructed life dissolve in real time while Graham Whitaker stood quietly at the edge of the frame with his daughter's hand in his. She left California before sunrise 3 days later and moved into a borrowed apartment outside Boston, owned by a law school friend who didn't ask many questions. No photographers there, no galas, no image to maintain, just silence, and inside that silence, a truth she could no longer avoid. Graham had never betrayed her. He had disappeared to protect her from a danger she never even knew existed, and he had carried that secret alone for nearly a decade without once using it to make her feel guilty. 2 months later, on a gray Tacoma afternoon thick with drizzle, Vivian finally found the courage to visit. She almost turned the car around twice before pulling up outside a small community center where Nora's piano recital was being held. Through the window, she spotted Graham in the front row, calm as ever, a little older around the eyes, still carrying that same grounded stillness that seemed to make every room around him quieter. Nora spotted her first, eyes widening before breaking into an enthusiastic wave through the glass. Graham turned slowly. Neither of them moved for a long moment. "Hi," Vivian said softly once she'd made her way inside. "Hi, Vivian." No anger in his voice. Somehow that made it harder. Nora bounded over. "You came. I hoped that would be okay. Daddy said maybe you would." Nora grabbed her hand. "I'm playing 2 songs. I practiced for 1,000,000 years." "That's very impressive," Vivian managed, glancing at Graham, who looked down briefly before admitting quietly, "She wanted to send you the program herself. I just didn't stop her." After the recital, Nora ran off toward the parking lot with a friend, and Graham and Vivian stood beneath the community center's narrow awning while rain ticked softly against the gutter. "I'm sorry," Vivian finally said. "Not because of what happened with Desmond, not because of any of that. I'm sorry because I stopped seeing who you really were long before I ever left." Graham looked out at the rain. "You were young." "No," she said. "I was selfish. And you let me leave with my dignity intact instead of making me face that, and I never even thanked you for it." He didn't argue, which somehow made the moment heavier than if he had. "Why didn't you ever hate me?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "Because loving someone deeply doesn't just switch off because they hurt you. I used to think maybe if things had been easier for us back then, it would have gone differently. Did you ever stop loving me?" The silence stretched long enough that the answer existed before he spoke it. "No," he admitted quietly. "But loving someone and going back to the way things were aren't the same thing." Something in Vivian's chest finally gave way, the gently, not violently, the realization at last of what it actually meant to lose someone good. Not dramatic, not vengeful. Just the quiet understanding that some people love you honestly, once, and after you let them go, they simply don't belong to you anymore. Nora ran back under the awning, clutching a crayon drawing she'd made during the wait. "Daddy, look!" She held up a sketch of 3 figures standing beside a piano, all holding hands. Vivian noticed the detail immediately, all 3 of them, connected. "I made it because sad people should still be friends," Nora said simply, looking between them. Graham let out a soft laugh under his breath. Vivian wiped her eyes quickly before Nora could notice, though it was too late. "Did I say something wrong?" Nora asked, suddenly uncertain. "No, sweetheart," Vivian said. "You said something exactly right." Graham took the drawing gently and folded it along its careful crayon lines before tucking it into his jacket pocket. "I think it's beautiful," he said. Nora beamed and ran off again toward the swings near the parking lot, leaving the 2 adults standing together in a silence that, for the first time in 9 years, didn't ache quite so much. "Do you think people can forgive each other without getting the old life back?" Vivian asked quietly. Graham watched Nora swinging through the gray afternoon light, rain drifting softly across the empty lot. "I think forgiveness is just accepting that the love was real," he said, "even when life carried it somewhere else." Vivian nodded slowly, tears slipping down her face without resistance now. Graham tucked the folded drawing deeper into his coat and looked out toward the fading light. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, neither one of them felt trapped by what had already happened.